Good morning, everyone. Ashton will be summarizing this next section. There he is. Floor is yours, Ashton.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and just for anyone who doesn't know, uh, watching this, or yeah, just so that we're all on the same page, uh, today, this is session 8 or 9. You're muted.
Session 9.
Okay, cool. So we either, if you have the text that Matt and I are reading, we're covering today 161 through 181, or in chapter 4, or paragraphs 47 through 60. So I just wanted to start out by mentioning something that I mentioned last time I gave the summary, which is, or maybe it was the time before last, but I find Samuel Taylor Coleridge's concept of separative projection really helpful in framing the way what Steiner is delivering here, and that if you're not familiar with that idea, basically it's grounded on his like metaphysics of polarity, and the idea that polarity is in reality triunity, and the relationship between the poles is a kind of reference back to the primordial unity, and that everything in the cosmos and cosmic evolution is woven through this kind of unceasing progressive creativity of polarity. So there's like this ongoing process of like polarizing, coming into like a kind of distinction, and then uh, Coleridge describes it as a tendency towards individuation, or individuation with the tendency to reproduce attachment. So anyway, I find that a really helpful frame for understanding what's going on here, especially like keeping in mind that it's not just a repetition, but a non-identical repetition of that kind of primordial dynamic that builds on itself. So there, we could think of it as like this fractal process, which it indeed is, as Steiner narrates it with the angels, the different hierarchies sort of progressing at their own rate, and then there's just so much going on with the more rebellious spirits at the same time. So anyway, in this section, I think one of the, I guess, key words that we could use to describe it, which Steiner uses, or at least this is the word in translation, is that at the moon epoch is very much a picture, I guess, in its middle phase, which seems to be the kind of essence of each epoch, is intermediate. And so it's a kind of a picture of the polarities that are very distinct for us, according to Steiner, during the Earth epoch, before they had become as polarized. So like just to backtrack a little bit, because the conditions that he describes on the moon are very much related to this rebellion that he briefly mentioned in the passage that Matt summarized last time. And the way he described that is uh, that I guess during the beginnings of the moon epoch, there are beings that are like kind of like a combination of like Saturn and Moon, and then beings that are more, I guess, bound up with the sun, and so there had to be this separation. And the fall or the rebellion arises when there are, I guess, beings who are unwilling, because they wish to have a kind of independent life, to be the kind of prosthetic for the higher beings on the sun's self-reflection. So they refuse this kind of like um, ecological existence or ecstatic existence for a kind of independent existence. So that sort of sets up the stage for what happens during the moon evolution. So I used the word intermediate as Steiner does. He also uses the word in this passage twofold, because as a result of this fall or rebellion, this a twofold nature starts to develop. And so he describes progressively that there's this alternation that begins to happen between the sun and the moon body, where that which has analogies with different aspects of our experience during what he calls the Earth epoch. And so at least he's focused on, I guess, the ancestor of the human being during this passage. But so during like the sun phase, the human proto-human or human ancestor is kind of given up and surrender, selfless surrender to the activity of the higher beings on the sun. And Whereas when those beings are not facing the sun, they kind of come into themselves and experience what he describes as a picture consciousness, which I'll say more about in a moment. But that is the kind of, I guess, activity connected with these faller beings promoting an independent life. And so there's this rhythm back and forth between um, giving up of the like proto self in surrender to these higher beings on the sun, and this coming back into a kind of more sclerotic form, but also one that allows for this kind of inner reflection and like proto self experience. And so if you've worked with the calendar of the soul at all or are familiar with the way Steiner describes like the, I guess, the character of uh, the seasonal round, this is sort of, at least for us, according to Steiner, during the Earth epoch, pictured in the rhythm of summer and winter. Winter being the time when we would come into ourselves and experience more of that inner brooding, and summer being the time where we're more given up to the world. But he also makes connections with this between um, what sleep, which would be more in connection with the sun phase, and the more clear wakefulness, as well as with the life after death and the life between birth and death, which is kind of like being entombed. I thought of Plato describing the body as a tomb. Um, yeah, but these still, as he emphasizes, these are not yet as distinct as they are during the Earth epoch. So, like, we can't even really speak uh, everything sort of relative as when it comes to life and death. But anyway, so this whole this alternation is like a kind of alternation in consciousness, and the cosmic, I guess, outer picture reflects that. So, and 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 in connection, I guess further examples of this intermediate character are there's like a lack of differentiation. Maybe there's a polarity. I'm not sure if Steiner talks about this, but he says there's a kind of in-betweenness of breathing and nutrition for the human ancestor, where we were like caught up in this dense vapor environment, and there's not really like the like different creatures are really just like more congealed aspects of this dense vapor environment. And there's also less of a polarization between ideation and reproduction, which is, I guess, another polarity in the Earth epoch, but which is closer together in this one. And something he multiple times draws this connection or contrast between what he calls this inner picture consciousness that is being experienced, especially during the moon phase, and what we experience as external perception. And he says that the inner picture consciousness is similar to what we experience as dream consciousness, but the symbolism is non-arbitrary, and it's a kind of like accurate representation of the outer activity, which is itself uh, the activity of higher beings. And so there's not, he says, in comparison to external perception, there's not this possibility, this slippage that allows for freedom. So there's a kind of like, atavistic or instinctual attunement to the world process because it's non-arbitrary. It's like an accurate representation of everything that's going on. Um, but through this ongoing process of alternation, um, more of a slippage does arise. Um, and he also mentions that as like the human ancestor experiences coming back or like awakening to itself out of the sun phase of sleep and union with the higher beings, that there's also this experience of the angel, or he says the sons of life, which I think are the angels. The angel coming back down into him or into her or the proto-human, and then ascending again into the sun phase. So this alternation, there's a kind of proto I self experience, but that the angel is the I guess the human ancestor is the prosthetic also for the angel self perception. But that yeah, that there's a kind of symbiotic um, dynamic going on here, productive of like a incipient self experience in the human ancestor, but the human stage for the angel, using the human ancestor as a kind of prosthetic for its own self perception. And he says um, also that in the astral body of this ancestral human, um, this manifests as images, and starts to, I guess, extend itself further into the physical body as the rudiments of the nervous system. And then there's this again, there's like after the process of polarization, when through this cycling of the alternation, uh, the ancestral human has achieved a higher state. They're now ready for the sun to return. And so there's a reunion, a reproduction of attachment or unity. And now everything that had been more dense, those different kingdoms on the moon that were more dense, are like caught up into the sun existence and have to become more etherealized. And Steiner also talks about during this time that the spirits of wisdom ensoul the human with wisdom, and this allows for the human to become independent, and that everything from the moon existence, these different kingdoms become permeated with wisdom, and that this is sort of like setting the stage for the beginning of Earth evolution. But he describes this situation, this new unity, as the cosmos of wisdom, and that yeah, again, that this is like the sort of beginning context of Earth evolution, and it's just something that I've found mysterious and not quite sure how to understand, because um, as I was reading this before I got to the section where he said a little bit about methodology, like this may not be as conceptually clear and defined as some people might like it to be. I felt that way. I was like, well, what does he mean by wisdom exactly? Um and apart from just calling it wisdom, what is wisdom? And if the beings weren't permeated with wisdom before, um was it just, I guess, an aspect of the higher beings and their activity? And Yeah, so that's a question. Like, what is he says he's presenting pictures for the spiritual eye. And if that's the case, what is wisdom for the spiritual eye? That's a question I'll just leave off with. And yeah, that's it for my summary. Max, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Ashton. I just wanted to pick up on your kind of question for all of us about wisdom and how it relates to love. Steiner, um, in Steiner's conception, the like our present embodiment is the embodiment in which we realize we transform the cosmos of wisdom into the cosmos of love. I think I have that right. Um, and so I guess the question for us is, as you posed, what is, what does that exactly entail? What is wisdom, and how is love different than wisdom? One way that I've come to think of wisdom is, well, first I think it's important to consider the 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 word wisdom itself. And I've looked into this, and the WIS in wisdom is the same as the VIS in the Latin word vision. That's a familiar English word for us too, vision. Wisdom actually has something to do with seeing. You can trace it back further. In Latin, there's different forms of that verb that's related to see. If you say so vision is maybe the noun form, but if you say video, we say we have like videos. Whoever was developing the technology decided to call it by the Latin word for, it's the conjugation of the verb in the first person. So video means I see. And then this then creates a bridge back to the Greek counterpart to this word. The vid from video is the same as the id in idea, and you see that Greek actually has like a silent v or a silent w at the beginning. So I like to place all these words together and collect them together just to show the relationships and the metamorphoses, because Steiner scholars, and then to a greater extent people who have studied Barfield's theses, will see the necessity of doing this in the latter days for us, because our words have become much more fragmented. Is kind of, it's looking at the negative side of things. We like with one word we mean much less than what many ancient words mean. Logos is a great example. I think we've talked about that. How many, if you want to translate, if you want to render one single Greek word into English, you have countless options. And I think the same goes for idea in Greek. And so wisdom I've thought of, and this is combining some of Steiner's teachings with the tradition going back to Plato. Wisdom has to do with a direct perception of the good. So wisdom, you can paraphrase wisdom as the idea of the good or the vision of the good. And so just consider that the good will, a vision of the good will entail different ways of life for different beings. Like if you're a plant, that looks like one thing, realizing the good in you and having that kind of wisdom to realize. And if you're a human, that looks very different. And the fly in the ointment for us actually is we don't have, like as human beings, we don't have that immediate perception of the good anymore. We have to arrive at it through philosophy. But then going back to the question of what is the difference between wisdom and love, I think, like so many words, love can be said in many different ways. But I think consistently the way Steiner often uses it is that love entails freedom. Like love is the realization of, in a certain way, love is the realization of what wisdom can function without freedom. Love requires freedom as a necessary precondition. So there's something about how we have to actually be deprived of. So when we talk about instinct in animals, that's another. I mean, so animals have this kind of inheritance of wisdom through nature that we call by instinct. But you see that human beings, like our instinct, we don't have the robust instinctive life that animals have. It's like we've fallen away from the natural wisdom. But that's also, so if we don't, but that also comes with the possibility to realize it on a higher level, in the new cosmos, the cosmos of love. For human beings now, it's not something we just inherit. It's something we have to actually collaborate towards the realization of it. And so those are just a couple thoughts. I hope that hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think as you were sharing, I was thinking of it, just I guess inclined me to think about the way Steiner's beginning his description of this epoch and the former epochs. There's like the existence of these lower beings, or the like the ancestral human form that is initially a kind of like virtual reality, being brought into being by the activity of the higher beings, not yet having an autonomous existence or even a kind of like distinct existence that and other beings as well, that the kind of the giving of wisdom, as you described it, like that having this kind of like inner compass for one's good, whatever it might be, depending on what kind of being you are, is sort of like enfolded into the beings, and allowing for this kind of distinct existence that wasn't there before. Anyway, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Ashton and Max, for unpacking wisdom. It strikes me that, yeah, wisdom, as you said, Max, is always present, but freedom needs to be developed. And these pictures that Steiner presents to us from the moon epoch of, he uses the word sheltering and describes the way that, as the human is ripening, it needs this environmental sheltering from higher beings, and that initially, as the astral body is beginning to differentiate, it doesn't yet have this I am consciousness. That's held by the sons of life at this point. But that the human astral body, there's at least the beginning of a sense that these pains and pleasures belong to me. It's not just pain and pleasure that's undifferentiated, but there's a gradual internalization of that. And then he describes that during the night or death, or between night and death, when on the moon, when the human astral body begins to feel more individuated, that there's a kind of feeling of being shrouded by a cloud, or kind of I cloud, and a beginning sense of this I consciousness, but it's still a group consciousness, and the I as an individuated being is again still being held or mirrored, or I guess the sons of life are being mirrored back by this gradually differentiating astral body of the humans. And so the I is still environmental in a sense relative to the human being. And this process of mirroring of separative projection, as Ashton invited us to consider it, is a process of wisdom, of seeing through the mirroring, but that the freedom to have that wisdom as to be possessed by or possess it oneself hasn't yet developed, because the I hasn't been fully internalized yet. But I really just wanted to emphasize these metaphors that or pictures that Steiner's giving us of a sheltering and of a cloud-like shroud wherein this I consciousness is beginning to be developed. I thought that was quite evocative.
Thanks. Yeah, I forgot to mention, Matt, that yeah, just this description of like the angel, uh the self-experience. It's not just like through individual ancestral humans, but groups of them. And I just love that picture. Jeff?
Oh, this is really good. Thank you. I'm thinking of the 7 life processes here and perception, because when I did that little presentation haltingly, I drew from Steiner's Riddle of Humanity, and in this case particularly lecture 7, where he's talking about the old moon specifically, and he talks about it in such a beautiful way. And later on he talks about the importance of art. This reflects on two sessions ago, maybe it was last week. I was watching, I didn't participate, where the way to access the perceptive quality, the cognitive quality of the life processes is through religion and art. Right. And so what's happening, what he describes in Riddle of Humanity that adds a little flavor to what is being described here, is that our ancestors are developing a perception, are developing perception. And I like this term, prosthesis, though I think it's a little bit mechanical. Like, I think what we are still can be thought of is the eyes and ears of the spiritual world in a certain sense. Right, including us now as spiritual beings, utilizing our physical bodies and our intellectual soul as reflectors toward that which we're going to be. but that are simulative now, or that are representative. But there was none of that representative bit for any beings at that point, as I read it. And it's a lot like children. And as I see the early phases of childhood as an old moon-like phases, particularly with my son, did I notice this time around. He's 9 now, so he's coming out of that. But but the idea that the senses were alive, and that there were 7 senses, and they were 7 of the senses that we have today. I won't go into it, like what's not involved and what is involved, but what the experience was something like breathing in this perception. And it's really interesting. I just want to sort of end with a question, I guess. Is this again what Plato is meaning by the cave wall? That this wisdom that's being experienced as non-representative, as we living through lines of the wisdom, projected now onto the intellectual soul, as he describes the life body now imbued with wisdom, projects into the intellectual soul, indeed probably forms the intellectual soul, makes an eidos out of it. And I find that really fascinating, that wisdom then would have meant perception, not cognitive reflection. Now we mean cognitive reflection because we have to turn the reflection or the representation back into the real thing somehow. So I find that existentially very helpful, and helpful also as a father.
Can I just say, for us, we mean intellectual reflection when we're talking about wisdom, but for other beings, we actually still mean perception.
I was just thinking, Jeff, as you were sharing about when Steiner says like that these this picturing was a kind of formative force, and that like it actually constitutes like that the beings, they become what they're picturing. And like it makes me think of animals in the way that different Goethean scientists talk about like the form is also the activity, and there's like this continuity between perceiving, and the sense activity and just the morphology of the being. And yeah.
Yes, that's what Aristotle would have meant by conformity theory too, probably. There's a through line for Aristotle as an initiate who would have been perceiving that. Yeah, I was going to make another point, but I'll come back to it. I forgot what it was. Oh, it was actually, I'm sorry. It was to do with what Max said. Yes, true, Max, that the wisdom is an active perception by say spiritual beings, and that we still do that.
And animals.
We have it, and animals. Yes, and animals. Well, they are. Well, that's a different question. But what I wanted to say to that is that then also, as part of this continuity that seems clear to me from this chapter, we are perceiving the world for spiritual beings. So we are the perceptive device to at least some degree.
One more thing, just to what between you both, that moment in this reading selection where Steiner's talking about the inner picturing, and that the pictures that appear in correspondence with the various other kingdoms of the moon are also at the same time the activity of these higher beings. So the animals are the high, yeah, and which is very much, I think, continuous with different native traditions around the world, and the way they talk about the animals as like representations of powerful beings. Anyway, Bruce, love to hear from you.
Hi, thanks everyone. Excuse me. Thanks everyone. So I can relate a little bit of an experience that I had a couple of weeks ago in a specific context. I'll give the context briefly, and then I'll explain the experience in its relationship to Aston's question about wisdom. So I host some what are like Bohmian dialogues. If you know what Bohmian dialogue is, that's good. They're similar to that. I'd say, let's say, heart-centered conversations where we try to slow down the conversation and reach something that is not kind of understanding in a way, but it's not just understanding. That is not the providence of any one person, but that only really comes about because there's this group of people with a different kind of intent together. And I'll be hosting one of those again on this Thursday at 5 p.m. through the Deep Transformation Network. I'll post a link in the chat after I'm done speaking, if any one of you would like to join us. You have to join the Deep Transformation Network to see it. It's completely free, and you don't have to get emails from there or anything. But that's where the link is in that link to the Zoom meeting. So a couple of weeks ago, I was hosting one of these, a very small group, and we were talking about or beginning with what is hard thinking. And these conversations often go in different directions as we go on with them. So as the conversation continued, I had a very interesting experience. I saw something like a star. And the star came down and entered my heart. And from my heart, it expanded outward, kind of into the group. And I had the feeling of immense wisdom. Just one of the most transformative experiences of my life, just in these few moments. So I was talking about during this time about some of the things I had done in my life and about some of the problems. And so there had been a good deal of trauma about 9 years ago in relationship to my work that went on for a very long time and was very traumatic. It was very transformative in a very negative way. And in some ways, I'm having physical problems now because it was so stressful over a long period of time. And there are also other things that happened. I know people talk about Goethean science, and in my work, I brought what I thought was Goethean science into the 21st century. I connected it to cognitive psychology. I made software that taught in a different way. I did experiments that showed that the software and the way I was teaching was effective. I could really transform how students pictured things in their minds because of the way we were doing this. And it was completely ignored, especially among anthroposophists. Absolutely couldn't get an anthroposophist to look at it, no matter what I did. And pretty much ignored by anyone else too, even under very weird situations. It was really cool work. And so I was asking, here's this wisdom filling me, and say, what is that about? I'm like, to know why and all this crap happened to me. And, why wasn't this work accepted? This and other work that I've done accepted. I mean, I wrote a book on Emerson, and it's sold like 2 copies over the last 15 years, maybe 3. So what I understood was that my experiences in life weren't about the things that I was thinking they were about. It wasn't about, none of that was about being recognized. It's still hard for me to accept that in the part of me that was just talking about the traumas. That part of me has a hard time accepting that. But in that moment, I completely got it. I completely got it and accepted it and saw that this was real wisdom that had shaped my life. Well, that's what I wanted to share. And I wanted to share the context from it because I believe these kind of experiences are not necessarily experiences that we have as individuals. They're experiences that can come as groups. And that's one of the reasons why I think these ideas of Bohmian dialogue or counsel or whatever you want to call heart-centered conversation, I think those kinds of conversations are very important for us today. And I'll post a link in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Bruce. I appreciate how it sort of foregrounds the way in which I guess wisdom is not always congruent with the the desires for outer affirmation or what have you, that we might seek in connection with our I guess the inheritance that we have from those rebellious beings who wanted their own independent life. Karsten.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm wondering when I'm reading this stuff, I'm thinking about Whitehead's saying that the important thing about a proposition is not that it's true, but that it's interesting. And the importance of truth is that it adds to interest. And I'm having a hard time reading this stuff because it's very difficult for me to connect it with my everyday life experience. And also I'm thinking about what Matt shared the last time. I was not here, but I heard it afterwards where I think it was the last time where he was talking about this kind of staying with the phenomenology, you could say. So this just doesn't become purely speculative, but you have this, you're connected to your visceral feelings, your inner organs, and you're experiencing this not only with your brain, but with your whole organism and body. And so I guess my question here is simply, why do you think that this is interesting? Exactly. I mean, I haven't had this problem before with Steiner because everything I've read about I mean, all the books that went before, The Riddles of Philosophy and Philosophy of Freedom, and also the astronomy course, I found it all very interesting. And sometimes I can vaguely sense that there's something happening here, but I just want to kind of lay my insecurity out in the open as a question. Why is this interesting? Why do we want to know about this?
Karsten, that's a great question. Looks like we have some people lining up to respond. Max, go ahead.
Just very quickly, I'll say by analogy to how the mathematical function of a Fourier transform works by decomposing some phenomenon into its component parts. Mathematically, you can do that with like a frequency or a musical chord even, or a sound of a voice, all kinds of applications. But by analogy, I feel our experience comes to us just as though fired from a gun, to quote Steiner. And something like this can actually help us to, quote, decompose what we just take as like the ordinary world today into its actual elements.
Jeff?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. Carson, that's a great question. And I was actually just having this conversation with my wife this morning, who is going through a kind of a revolution herself, and she's decided to jump in fully to Waldorf education. She's an educator. And so her first assignment was to read esoteric science, and typical to Waldorf, if I may critique Waldorf a little bit, is they shy away from this stuff in this chapter 4, because it's so outlandish, apparently. It seems like this guy just made this stuff up, right? But if he did, he had a rather powerful imagination, and this leads me to this thought, which is, well, she was saying herself that chapter 4 is like, up to this chapter, I'm fine. She said, I don't get this. I can't relate it to anything. And I can relate to that totally. Like this is the first time I have been able to relate it to something, and I'm not sure if I can really get at all of it. But maybe just a taste of it, to use the language of this chapter, in the last chapter, or the beginnings of this chapter, is that it's conciliant. like first of all, there's a narrative, and it's an evolutionary narrative. And it's not that linear narrative that we were ubiquitously trained on as natural science, as a religion has trained us on, right? And so the idea that we arose from inert matter just through motional and chemical activity is absurd. It's a cartoon, it's a caricature, and it's not very satisfying. And the thing that I keep coming back in reading this chapter now is it's like nutrition. It really feels nutritive. And so that was part of my answer to her. But also, it's also, if you follow the epistemological process as we did with the philosophy of freedom, and you just take this notion of wisdom that's in our life body, that we are inherently built out of wisdom to some extent as the connective tissue that holds us together, the coherence, and that wisdom is projecting into our intellect, and that's a traceable epistemological process. So you can trace, I mean, it's mysterious. I'm not saying I can really explain it, but it is the visceral process that one can have at least through epistemology. I would say Steiner's epistemology, the non-presumptive one, where you see how your thoughts are arising and how they form on that cave wall of your consciousness, of your intellect. So that's a short answer for the best I could do for right now, I would say. I totally get it though, man.
Before we get to Jeff Corintero, Karsten, would you like to respond at all?
Yeah, just say briefly that I think one of the things I find challenging is that in my conception of life, it's based on an active principle, not only in life in general, but in each individual life unit. So even, I mean, if you have bacteria, for example, and you have them in some kind of resolution where there's a gradient of nutrition, the bacteria will actually move towards the part of the resolution where the concentration of nutrients are largest. So it's very fundamental about life that there's this active principle in individual life units. And what I'm struggling with here is that Stein is describing this thing as something that is happening to these beings that were us. And it's kind of there's a passive how to say it, the passivity in the process, in the individual. It's like it's a creational process that is happening to them, like this old image of the God creating some being. So I'm curious about where is this active principle in each life unit in all of this.
Yeah, I think I feel like with Steiner in general, the way of thinking about life is especially at this point is much more like there's not really a distinction between life and death at this point in his description, and it's almost like the whole cosmos. It's more, I think, like a pre-modern conception of life is like the whole is alive, and that movement is an expression of that, and then as you know, he's progressing, talking about the spirits of wisdom granting wisdom to the beings, that maybe that's connected with what you're describing as like the kind of uh units of life. But anyway, I can relate to what you described as like the remoteness from experience, and especially the first time I read it, it's almost kind of like like aversion a bit. But for me, like connecting it with my experience of the seasons, and Steiner's Calendar of the Soul, it feels more near to me than it did the first time I read it. Anyway, Jeff, thank you for your patience. Go ahead.
Hi, Carson. Yeah, I've been thinking of a version of your question all throughout this book and probably beyond. I guess I'm not being flippant, but so far this book has changed my relationship to my dog. And going back to it was at chapter 2, sorry if I'm misquoting, but earlier in the book when he's talking of like he's basically laying out the very basic the four bodies, physical, etheric, astral, and the I being, and how animals do not have memory, like in the way humans do. Anything like they have an astral relationship to things, and as I say, my relationship to my dog, I keep thinking about this chapter and that distinction, between the astral and the ontic. And I walk into a room and there's my dog on the couch, and his tail starts to wag when he senses I'm there. I'm like, well, I think about my dog in general, his relationship to all different people and who he likes and loves and who he hates and who he barks at and all that. It's like, how does, my wife and I have been having this conversation. Is that not memory? Doesn't he not remember who is who and, who he, but anyways, just to say that going deeply into the spirit of the book, it's really meditating on this and taking Steiner at his word and thinking, okay, well, I'm going to meditate on this and look at my dog through this concept and just appreciate that, yeah, that's an astral activity that's happening. That's not a memory activity. Like it's an astral relationship, between himself and any other being around him. Like we were away for several months last summer, left him with a friend. And when we came back, just, yeah, his non-memory dogness, just came charging at me because here I was again. I was absent for all that time. But yeah, that wasn't a memory like, oh yeah, there's that guy again. But this, to understand the astral body. Anyways, I've been meditating on this through the book and coming more into our current chapter. It's very detailed in all these evolutionary processes and what's going on the moon, and of course we've gone through the previous planets, and at another level, similarly, I'm meditating on my understanding of Hawkins medicine, of physiology, of the history of the human being. So we, in school, we got a very basic, the fourfold human, physical, etheric, astral, ontic. I mean, almost kind of a caricature in one level. I mean, it has to be basic at the beginning, but yeah, this is kind of a great deepening meditation on, what's really, and I guess my thought, I'll maybe end on this idea, is I'm really appreciating and really getting as I read through the book this time is, all these ancient planetary cycles, Saturn, Sun, Moon, all these things that happened before now, all the planets before now, they're not in some ancient past, like, in a galaxy far, far away or whatever it says at the beginning of Star Wars, but it's still all present here and now. So it's similar to our previous discussions, we have the capacity here and now to participate, the moon and all these other phases that are still alive, in our physiology now, in our consciousness now. And it's not just like reading a history book of, what happened, way back when, So anyways, I'll just kind of leave it there. I think I'll have a better answer to this question if we come back a year from now and, kind of continue the conversation, but that's kind of where I'm sitting with all this right now.
Thanks, Jeff. Matt?
I'm so glad that you raised this question again, Karsten, because it comes up for me a lot. And here's the best I have done for myself reflecting on this. In our current common sense, more or less, scientific materialist picture of the past, we project what is unique to the Earth phase of the Earth epoch of evolution in Steiner's sense back to the beginning. And, a materialist will try to imagine a past before the human being was here, when it was just plasma, just atoms, just stars and galaxies, just primeval molten Earth before the crust had even solidified. And the idea is, well, there was no human being yet, and yet they're imagining the past from a human perspective. And so on some level, there is no way to understand the past except by accepting that we were there in some way, if we're going to engage in that activity at all. And rather than pretend that we could avoid that, Steiner is fully leaning into that and saying, okay, if we can't escape that, then the what becomes true. And the difficulty of this is that we're like right now, our Earth form with physical, etheric, astral, and I layers formed through these planetary epochs. We're like a cake that has been baked. And the effort Steiner is engaged in is, as Leif was saying, to kind of decompose that cake. But the butter and the sugar and the other ingredients at this baked stage are all melted and changed and transformed as a result of this process. And so it's not just like you remove the top layer and then you see the past. It's not just a simple sedimentation. It's like everything has been transformed. What the physical was on Saturn is totally different now on Earth. And so that makes this a very difficult process. And the most impressive thing about this text for me so far is when Steiner admits the difficulty and how much more difficult it becomes the earlier he goes. And it's as if he's trying to invite us to grow a new organ of perception by which we might, yes, perceive this past in the right way, but we're also trying to perceive the very formation of our current organs of perception. And so there's a recursive doubling here. And, you know, I think the key here for me is yes, I'm struggling to make this phenomenological in the Goethean sense, and to not allow there to be a separation between my experience and what Steiner is describing, while at the same time having to form new concepts in order to grasp the exercise that I'm trying to engage in here. And, you know, there are a few key things that I can understand just and have understood from my study of like contemporary biology, like, you know, that organisms and their environments are always totally unified. And so when we think of the human form today and we look out and we see the animals and the plants and the sky and the stars and everything, the entirety of the environment that we perceive around us is anthropomorphized. It's a reflection of our own state of consciousness and our own way of seeing. And so if we keep that in mind as we move through these prior epochs, and also keep in mind something that keeps coming up in this chapter, the importance of sleep and death and the pralaya, like this intervening phase between each planetary epoch, where Steiner says, look, I can't see what's going on then, even as a clairvoyant. And so there's these, it's just like in our daily lives, we try to remember back to when we were born, and it's very easy for us to forget that every night we go to sleep and our consciousness goes away. And so remembering the past in this way requires a kind of dying to our common sense understanding of a continuity, because there is continuity, but there are these interruptions, and some transformation happens in between. You know, every night we go to sleep, and Steiner's using that fact to clue us into the transformation that happens between death and a new birth, and the transformation that happens between these planetary epochs, which it requires a leap to connect these transformations. So that's a bit of a jumble, but you know, that's some of what comes up for me when I struggle with this question of how to make this phenomenological. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Everett, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for all the comments, and thank you, especially Bruce. Thank you for sharing that part of your experience. We all have experiences, and some of them are very difficult to share in a group like this. So it requires a certain degree of trust, and I just wanted to tell you that I certainly appreciate that. And secondly, I was going to say that your introduction, Ashton, and several other points that have been made today, Matt, your point that you just made, uh, remind me of what I got from the reading, what I'm getting from the readings, what I get from almost all the readings that I've ever read from Steiner, and that is this powerful sense of rhythm. There is this alternation, this that that he's constantly describing, whether it be between sleep and death, whether it be between birth and life, whether it be between the interaction between the circulation of the blood and the air that we breathe in and out, whether it be the incarnations or the planetary movements. All of those things have a quality of rhythm to them. They all have a quality of frequency that I find or view it as formative, very formative. Like there's shapes and forms that are resulting as a result of this going and coming, this pulsation, this rhythm that happens in all of life. And it makes me wonder what and Max was talking about deconstruction and decomposition. What if I just remove everything except the rhythms that I can perceive? What if everything else I could obliterate from my mind and only perceive the rhythmic processes going on around me? What would that look like? And I'm reminded of, and I know we don't have much time, so I'm going to wrap it up, but I'm reminded of the experiment where you can take a plate or a flat surface and play a frequency, a tone, and put sand on the plate, and the sand arranges itself in symmetrical forms. Depending on the tone, the forms can take a multitude of shapes. So it's like this frequency, that is formative, and there's a certain clairaudience that happens as I tune into the rhythms and the frequency, and I just feel that's important for us as we're striving to get our minds around this stuff that Steiner's talking about. So that's what I had to offer today. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks, Everett. Karsten, did you want to say anything? Saw your hand up earlier.
Well, just briefly to say thank you, everyone, for your input and your offerings. And also, maybe I should finish by saying the way I actually did relate to this is, I mean, Goethe, he had this flash of an insight that a plant is just a leaf at different stages of metamorphosis. And the way I did relate to this when I read it was I was thinking the human being as a mineral, the human being as a plant, the human being as an animal, and so on. And I don't know if that's what Steiner means, but that's what I was thinking while I was reading it. And I get that. I get this idea that, I mean, the idea of metamorphosis and the fact that there is, in essence, one kind of living being assuming all these different roles and stages and so on. And of course, I think that's interesting.
Thanks, Karsten. Seems like a great place to stop. Thanks everyone for being here. It's a great conversation today. So next week, session 9, if you have the book, actually, is it
Session 10.
sorry, session 10. If you have the book we're reading, Matt and I, that translation, it's 181 to 201. Or if you have paragraph numbers, chapter 4, paragraph 61 to 73. So see you all next week. Thank you.